The dust hadn't even settled from the Sunday service when Garrett Hawthorne decided to make his opinion known. Standing in the middle of Clearwater's main street, boots planted wide and hat tilted back, he pointed at the small woman walking ahead of him and declared loud enough for half the town to hear, "That little mouse couldn't hit the broad side of a barn if it was painted red and standing 2 feet away." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would become the story that defined Clearwater, Texas for generations to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Clearwater when Reverend Thomas Whitmore and his wife, Margaret, stepped out of their modest parsonage. It was the 3rd Sunday of September, 1887, and the air carried that familiar mix of prairie grass and cattle that defined their small Texas town. Margaret adjusted her simple blue dress and checked that her dark hair was properly pinned beneath her bonnet, while Thomas gathered his sermon notes with the careful precision of a man who had learned that preparation was everything in frontier ministry. Clearwater wasn't much to look at by most standards. 24 buildings lined the main thoroughfare, including Patterson's General Store, the Silver Dollar Saloon, and the small white church that Thomas had helped build with his own hands 3 years earlier. The town existed primarily because of the cattle drives that passed through twice a year, bringing cowboys, ranchers, and enough money to keep the businesses alive. For most of the year, though, life moved at the slow pace of farming communities everywhere. Thomas had arrived in Clearwater straight from seminary in Austin, full of enthusiasm and armed with theological knowledge that proved less useful than he'd hoped when dealing with practical frontier problems. His congregation consisted mainly of farmers' wives, a few elderly men, and whoever happened to be sober enough on Sunday mornings to attend service. The ranchers and cowboys who dominated the town's social hierarchy generally viewed church as something for women and children. Margaret had grown up in similar circumstances back in Oklahoma Territory, where her father had tried his hand at wheat farming before drought and grasshoppers convinced him to try carpentry instead. She'd met Thomas at a church social in Tulsa, impressed by his earnest desire to serve God and his complete lack of understanding about what frontier life actually entailed. They'd married quickly and headed to Texas with little more than their clothes, a few books, and an optimism that the first year of ministry had somewhat tempered. The walk to church took them past the heart of Clearwater's business district, where even on Sunday morning there was usually some activity. Today was no different. Several horses stood tied to the hitching post outside the Silver Dollar, and Margaret could hear the low murmur of conversation from inside. She'd learned not to look too closely at the saloon or acknowledge the men who frequented it, not because she disapproved necessarily, but because it seemed to make everyone more comfortable that way. Garrett Hawthorne emerged from the saloon just as they approached. At 35, he was everything Thomas wasn't. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came from owning the largest ranch in 3 counties and employing half the men in town. His Lazy H spread covered nearly 10,000 acres, and his cattle operations brought more money through Clearwater in a single season than the rest of the businesses combined made in a year. This gave him a certain authority in town affairs that had nothing to do with elected positions or formal titles. Garrett had been drinking, though not heavily. It was more of a social ritual than serious consumption. Sunday morning conversations at the Silver Dollar were where the town's important decisions actually got made, not in the official meetings at the schoolhouse. He'd been discussing the upcoming cattle drive with his foreman and 2 other ranchers when he'd noticed the minister and his wife walking past. "Morning, Reverend," Garrett called out, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was technically polite but carried an undertone of amusement. "Mrs. Whitmore." He nodded to Margaret, who returned the greeting with a quiet "Mr. Hawthorne" before looking away. Thomas had learned to navigate these encounters carefully. Garrett wasn't hostile to the church exactly, but he made it clear that he considered religion a private matter that shouldn't intrude on public life. He'd donated lumber for the church building and contributed to the minister's salary, but he'd never attended a service and seemed to view Thomas as something between a harmless eccentric and a necessary evil. "Beautiful morning for worship," Thomas said, attempting to strike a friendly tone. "You're always welcome to join us, you know." Garrett's smile was indulgent. "I appreciate that, Reverend, but I reckon I do my praying outdoors. God's got a fine church right here under the sky." The conversation might have ended there, as it usually did, but something about Margaret caught Garrett's attention. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, straight-backed and alert despite her obvious attempts to remain inconspicuous. Or perhaps it was the fact that she seemed to be studying the horses tied up outside the saloon with an intensity that struck him as unusual for a preacher's wife. "Your wife's quite the observer," Garrett commented to Thomas, loud enough for Margaret to hear. "Always watching everything real careful like." Margaret felt her cheeks warm, but kept her expression neutral. "I find horses interesting, Mr. Hawthorne. They tell you a lot about their riders. Is that so?" Garrett's tone became more pointed. "And what do mine tell you?" She glanced at his mount, a large bay stallion with excellent lines and careful grooming. "That you choose quality and take care of your investments. That horse has good breeding and professional training." "Well, I'll be damned," Garrett said, then caught himself and nodded apologetically toward Thomas. "Pardon my language, Reverend. Your wife knows her horses." Thomas felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. He'd learned that conversations about Margaret's knowledge of practical matters sometimes led to uncomfortable questions about her background, questions that he wasn't entirely sure how to answer. Margaret had grown up around horses and guns, and all the practical skills that frontier life demanded, but that seemed to make some people, particularly men like Garrett, view her as something of a curiosity. "Margaret's father was quite the horseman," Thomas said carefully. "She learned a great deal from him." "Just horses?" Garrett asked, and there was something in his tone that made Margaret look at him directly for the first time. "Or did Daddy teach you other frontier skills too?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that everyone present understood, but no one wanted to address directly. In frontier communities, knowing how to handle horses usually meant knowing how to handle firearms as well. It was a practical necessity, not a hobby. But women who were too knowledgeable about such things sometimes made men uncomfortable, especially men who prided themselves on being the protectors and providers. "I learned what I needed to learn," Margaret said quietly. "Nothing more than that." Garrett's laugh was not unkind, but it carried a note of skepticism. "Nothing more than that," he repeated. "Well, I suppose every lady needs to know her limitations." Thomas felt the comment like a physical blow. He'd grown up in Austin, where women were expected to be accomplished in domestic arts and perhaps a bit of music or literature. The idea that his wife might possess skills that exceeded his own in areas considered masculine was something he'd never quite learned to handle gracefully. He loved Margaret deeply, but he also felt protective of her reputation and his own position in the community. "Margaret is very accomplished in all the areas that matter for a minister's wife," Thomas said, intending it as a compliment, but somehow making it sound like a limitation. "I'm sure she is," Garrett replied, and the conversation might have ended there if Jake Morrison hadn't chosen that moment to emerge from the saloon. Jake worked for Garrett, managing the horse-breaking operation that supplied mounts for the lazy Hutch's Cowboys. He was younger than his boss, maybe 25, with the kind of swagger that came from being good at a dangerous job and knowing it. He'd been drinking more seriously than Garrett and was looking for entertainment. "What's all this about horses?" Jake asked, positioning himself beside Garrett in a way that made the group feel suddenly more crowded. The preacher's wife giving riding lessons? Just having a conversation about horseflesh, Garrett said. And there was a warning note in his voice that Jake either didn't catch or chose to ignore. Well, that's real interesting, Jake said, looking Margaret up and down in a way that made Thomas step closer to his wife. Most ladies I know can barely tell one end of a horse from the other. Course, most ladies I know got better things too. Do then worry about such matters. Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her, and she placed a gentle hand on his arm. She'd dealt with men like Jake before, men who felt the need to prove their superiority by diminishing others. The best approach was usually to simply ignore them, but something about his tone and the way he was looking at her made ignoring him feel impossible. I suppose we all have different talents, she said evenly. Some people are good with horses, others with different things. Different things, Jake repeated, and his grin was unpleasant. Like what? Sewing, cooking, singing hymns? Thomas had reached his limit. I think we should be getting to church, he said firmly. The service starts in 15 minutes. But Jake wasn't finished. Course, I suppose if you really knew horses, you'd know other things too, like shooting maybe. Hard to work with horses on the frontier without knowing how to protect them from wolves and such. The comment was clearly intended to embarrass Margaret, to put her in the position of either admitting ignorance or claiming skills that would be considered inappropriate for a woman in her position. It was a cruel little game, and everyone present recognized it as such. Margaret looked at Jake steadily. I know what I need to know, she said again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What you need to know, Jake repeated mockingly. Well, that's real modest of you, ma'am. Real modest indeed. Garrett had been watching this exchange with growing irritation. He didn't particularly care about the minister's wife one way or the other, but Jake's behavior was becoming embarrassing. This was exactly the kind of thing that gave cowboys a bad reputation and made townspeople think poorly of ranchers in general. That's enough, Jake, Garrett said quietly. Let these folks get to their church. But Jake was enjoying himself too much to stop. I'm just making conversation, boss. Just wondering if the preacher's wife is as handy with a gun as she is with spotting good horses. Seems like the kind of thing a person ought to know about their neighbors. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable now. He was essentially calling Margaret out, demanding that she either admit to skills that would be considered unseemly or accept being dismissed as just another helpless female. It was a no-win situation, and everyone present knew it. Margaret felt the weight of the moment. She could see Thomas's distress, Garrett's growing anger at his employee, and Jake's expectant smirk. She could also see a small crowd beginning to gather, other churchgoers, who had noticed the commotion and were approaching to see what was happening. I think, she said carefully, that this conversation has gone far enough. But Jake had crossed a line and seemed determined to keep going. Has it though? I mean, if you're going to act like you know about horses and such, it seems fair to wonder what else you might know. Or think you know. That's when Garrett made his mistake. Frustrated with Jake's behavior and eager to end the confrontation, he said the words that would change everything. Leave it alone, Jake. Can't you see the lady's just trying to be polite? She probably couldn't hit the broad side of a barn if you spotted her 10 yards. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gunshot. Margaret felt them settle into her chest, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of cold recognition. She'd heard similar words before, from men who assumed that quiet behavior meant weakness, that politeness meant inability. Thomas felt the comment like a slap. He wanted to defend his wife, but he also didn't want to escalate the situation. He was caught between his love for Margaret and his fear of making things worse for both of them. Jake, meanwhile, sensed that he'd won something. There you go, he said with satisfaction. Boss knows what he's talking about. Most ladies can't hit much of anything, and that's probably for the best. The small crowd that had gathered was growing larger. Sunday morning in Clearwater didn't offer much entertainment, and a confrontation between the town's most prominent rancher and the minister's wife was too interesting to ignore. Margaret could see faces she recognized: Mrs. Patterson from the general store, the Hendricks family who farmed just outside town, several of the men who worked for other ranchers. She also noticed something else. Across the street, leaning against the wall of the barber shop, stood Charlie Drummond. Charlie was different from the other men in town, older, quieter, with the kind of reputation that made people speak carefully around him. He'd been a buffalo hunter before the herds disappeared, then a scout for the army, and now he worked as a hunting guide for wealthy visitors from back east. More importantly, he was one of the few people in Clearwater who knew exactly what Margaret was capable of. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Charlie's slight nod told her everything she needed to know. He understood what was happening, and he was ready to back her up if necessary. Margaret looked back at Garrett, then at Jake, then at the growing crowd of onlookers. She thought about all the times she'd bitten her tongue, all the moments when she'd chosen silence over confrontation, all the occasions when she'd let people underestimate her, because it seemed easier than dealing with their discomfort. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said quietly, "I think you might be surprised by what some people can do when they have to." Garrett shrugged, already trying to move past the uncomfortable moment. "Maybe so, ma'am. But I reckon we'll never know, will we?" That's when Margaret made the decision that would change everything. "Actually," she said, "I think we will." The silence that followed Margaret's words stretched like a taut wire. Even Jake's smirk faltered as he tried to process what he'd just heard. Thomas felt his stomach drop, recognizing the tone in his wife's voice, the same quiet determination she'd shown when she'd insisted on coming to Texas despite his mother's objections. The same resolve that had gotten them through their first brutal winter when the church couldn't afford proper heating. "Now hold on there, Margaret," Thomas said softly, placing a hand on her arm. But she was already stepping forward, away from his protective gesture. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Whitmore?" Garrett asked, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and concern. He'd intended his comment about barn hitting as a way to deflect Jake's rudeness, not as a challenge to the minister's wife. Margaret's gaze swept the growing crowd, taking in the faces of people she'd served meals to after church services, women whose children she'd helped teach to read, men who'd tipped their hats politely while clearly considering her inconsequential. She saw Mrs. Patterson whispering urgently to her husband, saw the Hendricks boys pushing forward to get a better view, saw Charlie Drummond straightening up from his casual lean against the barbershop wall. "I'm proposing that we settle this question properly," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "You seem to have strong opinions about what I can and cannot do, Mr. Hawthorne. Perhaps we should find out who's right." Jake laughed, but it sounded forced now. "You can't be serious, lady. This is getting out of hand." "Is it?" Margaret asked, turning to face him directly. "You were the one who seemed so interested in my capabilities, Mr. Morrison. Surely you're not backing down now?" The crowd had grown to include nearly everyone who'd been planning to attend church that morning, plus several men who'd emerged from the saloon to see what the commotion was about. Word was spreading quickly through this small town, and Margaret could see people hurrying from nearby businesses and homes to witness whatever was about to happen. Dr. Samuel Harrison pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand as always. At 62, he was one of the most respected men in Clearwater, having delivered most of the children in town and patched up countless injuries over the years. He'd also served as a field surgeon during the war, which gave him a particular understanding of firearms and their effects. "What's all this about?" Dr. Harrison asked, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. "The preacher's wife seems to think she can outshoot the boys," Jake said, his bravado returning now that he had a larger audience. "We're just trying to talk some sense into her." Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose as he looked at Margaret, then at Thomas, then back at Margaret. "Is that so?" "What I think," Margaret said carefully, "is that people shouldn't make assumptions about what others can or cannot do without proper evidence." "Evidence," Dr. Harrison repeated thoughtfully. "That's a reasonable position." He paused, studying the faces around him. "Of course, if we're talking about evidence, we'd need to establish fair terms. Can't have a proper test without proper conditions." Garrett felt the situation slipping away from him. What had started as a minor embarrassment with Jake's behavior was turning into something much more significant. The whole town was watching now, and whatever happened next would be talked about for months, maybe years. "Now let's all just calm down," Garrett said, raising his hands in a peacekeeping gesture. "This has gotten out of hand. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sure you're a fine lady, but this isn't necessary. I didn't mean any offense." "I'm not offended," Margaret replied, and there was something in her voice that made several people in the crowd exchange glances. "I'm simply interested in accuracy." Thomas had been watching his wife with a growing alarm. He'd seen her handle firearms exactly once, shortly after their marriage, when a rabid dog had threatened their neighbor's children back in Oklahoma. She'd borrowed her father's rifle and put the animal down with a single shot at a distance that had impressed even the local sheriff. But that had been 2 years ago, and Thomas had assumed it was either luck or the kind of basic competence that most frontier women possessed. "Margaret," he said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." She turned to him with a look that was both gentle and implacable. "Thomas, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't something that can be discussed privately anymore. These gentlemen have made their position clear. Now I'm making mine." Charlie Drummond finally stepped forward from his position at the barber shop. His weathered face was expressionless, but those who knew him could see the hint of anticipation in his eyes. "Seems to me," he said in his gravelly voice, "that if we're going to do this, we ought to do it proper. Can't have folks claiming later that the test wasn't fair." "Charlie," Garrett said with obvious relief, "maybe you can talk some sense into everyone. This whole thing is getting foolish." But Charlie was looking at Margaret with something that might have been respect. "Don't reckon it's foolish at all, Garrett. Lady's got a right to defend herself against accusations of incompetence. Question is, what kind of test would satisfy everyone?" Jake, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the situation escalated beyond his control, tried to regain his position. "Well, if we're really doing this, it ought to be a real test. Not just shooting at a barn door or something easy." "What did you have in mind?" Margaret asked. Jake looked around, his mind racing. He needed to propose something that would either scare her off or ensure her failure, but he also couldn't make it so ridiculous that he'd look like a bully to the watching crowd. "How about targets at 50 yards? Real targets, not just big boards." "That seems reasonable," Margaret said without hesitation. "What kind of targets?" Dr. Harrison stepped forward again. "If we're doing this, we need to establish clear rules. Safety first, no one gets hurt. Second, the test needs to be fair to everyone involved. Third, we need impartial judges." "I'll judge," said a new voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to see Mayor Benjamin Crawford approaching. At 45, Crawford was a former territorial marshal who'd settled in Clearwater when his wife inherited her family's farm. He was known for his fairness and his absolute intolerance for anyone who questioned his decisions. "Frank," he called to Frank Patterson, who owned the general store, "you've got playing cards, right? The kind with the suit markers?" "Sure do, Ben," Patterson replied, already heading toward his store. "What are you thinking?" "Cards at 50 yards, Crawford said. 5 shots each. We'll tack the cards to fence posts, make sure everyone can see them clearly. Hit the suit marker, it counts. Miss the card entirely, it doesn't. A murmur ran through the crowd. Hitting a playing card suit marker at 50 yards was no simple task, even for experienced shooters. It required genuine skill, steady hands, and good equipment. "That's a real test," Charlie said approvingly. No luck involved, no excuses afterward. Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "Margaret, you don't have to do this. No one will think less of you if you step back." But Margaret was already nodding. "That sounds fair, Mayor Crawford. When do we start?" "Right now, if everyone's agreeable," Crawford replied. "No point in letting this fester. Frank, bring out 5 cards, all different suits. We'll set them up at the north end of town where there's a clear range and good backdrop." The crowd began moving, excitement building like electricity in the air. Word was spreading beyond the immediate area now, and people were emerging from houses and businesses all along the main street. Even some of the working girls from the saloon's upper rooms had appeared at the windows to watch Dot as they walked toward the designated shooting area. Margaret found herself beside Charlie Drummond. The old scout was studying her with curiosity. "You sure about this, young lady?" he asked quietly. "It's a hard shot, even for someone with experience." "I'm sure," Margaret replied. "But thank you for asking. What are you shooting with?" Charlie continued. "That little parlor gun most ladies carry won't do this kind of work." Margaret paused, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she looked uncertain. I don't have a gun with me, Mr. Drummond." Charlie's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. "Well, that's a problem we can solve. I've got a couple of rifles that might suit you. Question is, what are you comfortable with?" "I learned on a Springfield," Margaret said. "But I can handle most anything with decent balance." "Springfield, eh?" Charlie's eyebrows rose. "Army issue?" "My father served in the war," Margaret explained. "He kept his service rifle afterward." Charlie nodded slowly. "I've got a Winchester that might work for you. Good action, true sight, not too heavy. You want to try it before we start?" "That would be appreciated," Margaret said, grateful for the kindness in his offer. Meanwhile, Jake was having his own equipment discussion with Garrett. Unlike Margaret, he'd come prepared. His Colt revolver was a well-maintained piece that he'd used for years in his horse-breaking work. But 50 yards was at the outer edge of effective pistol range, and he was beginning to realize that his casual assumption about easy victory might have been premature. "Maybe I should get my rifle from the bunkhouse," he said to Garrett as they walked. "No," Garrett replied firmly. "You started this with talk about pistol work. You stick with your pistol." Jake felt a flash of irritation. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you made your bed, now you lie in it," Garrett said. "You wanted to embarrass that woman, and now you're worried she might embarrass you instead." The accusation stung because it was accurate. Jake had expected an easy victory over a helpless minister's wife, and the reality of the situation was becoming clearer by the minute. But backing down now would be worse than losing. "I'm not worried about anything," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. By the time they reached the shooting area, Frank Patterson had returned with a selection of playing cards. Mayor Crawford examined them carefully, then selected 5 cards of different suits and face values. "We'll use these," he announced. 2 hearts, 2 spades, 1 diamond. Different sizes, different colors, should make it interesting." The fence posts were already in place, remnants of an old corral that had been torn down the previous year. Crawford and Dr. Harrison worked together to tack the cards to the posts, measuring the distances carefully and ensuring that each target was clearly visible from the firing line. 50 yards exactly, Crawford called back to the crowd. "Clean shots, no obstructions." Margaret accepted the Winchester from Charlie and spent a few minutes familiarizing herself with the weapon. It was indeed well balanced, with a smooth action and clean barrel. She worked the lever several times, getting a feel for the mechanism, then raised it to her shoulder to check the sight picture. "How's that feel?" Charlie asked. "Good," Margaret replied. "Very good, actually." "Thank you." "You're welcome," Charlie said, then added quietly, "Just remember, this isn't about proving anything to them. It's about proving something to yourself." Margaret looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've been hiding who you are for a long time," Charlie said. "Maybe it's time to stop." Before Margaret could respond, Mayor Crawford called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got our targets set up and our rules established. 5 shots each at playing cards tacked to fence posts at 50 yards. Mrs. Whitmore will shoot first, then Mr. Morrison. Dr. Harrison and I will judge the results." The crowd had grown to include nearly everyone in town who wasn't bedridden or working essential jobs. Children had been boosted onto their fathers' shoulders for better views. The atmosphere was festive but tense, like a county fair competition. With higher stakes, Thomas stood near the front of the crowd, his face pale with worry. He'd never seen his wife in a situation like this, and he was discovering that there were aspects of her character that he'd never fully understood. The quiet, dutiful woman he'd married was revealing layers of strength and determination that both impressed and frightened him. Margaret stepped up to the firing line, the Winchester held naturally in her hands. She took a moment to study the targets, noting the wind direction and the way the morning light fell across the range. Then she raised the rifle, settled into her stance, and took her first shot. The crack of the rifle echoed across the town. At the target line, Dr. Harrison raised his field glasses and studied the rightmost card. "Clean hit," he called back. "Right through the heart symbol." A murmur ran through the crowd. One hit could be luck, but it was a promising start. Margaret worked the lever, chambering a fresh round. Her second shot followed quickly, and again Dr. Harrison's voice carried across the range. Another hit, spade symbol, clean through. The murmur grew louder. 2 hits meant this was no accident. Margaret's third shot took the diamond cleanly, and her fourth destroyed the second heart. The crowd was completely silent now, waiting for the final shot that would determine whether they were witnessing exceptional skill or just an impressive run of luck. Margaret took her time with the last shot, a spade symbol that seemed smaller than the others. She adjusted her stance slightly, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. 5 for 5, Dr. Harrison called out, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Every target hit, every shot clean. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Margaret lowered the rifle and stepped back from the line, her face flushed but composed. She'd done what she'd set out to do, but the implications were only beginning to sink in. Now it was Jake's turn, and everyone in Clearwater was watching to see what would happen next. Jake Morrison stood at the firing line, his Colt revolver feeling heavier in his hand than it ever had before. The weight of every eye in Clearwater pressed down on him as he stared at the 5 fresh playing cards that Frank Patterson had just finished tacking to the fence posts. The cheers for Margaret's perfect performance still echoed in his ears, and the silence that followed felt like a physical presence. He'd been so certain this morning, so absolutely convinced that he was dealing with a typical minister's wife, who might know which end of a gun was which but couldn't possibly possess real skill. Now he was facing the humiliating reality that Margaret Whitmore had just accomplished something that many experienced shooters couldn't manage on their best day. "Take your time, Jake," Mayor Crawford called out, his voice neutral but carrying an undertone that Jake recognized as warning. Crawford had been a lawman long enough to know when a man was about to make a bad situation worse, and his tone suggested that Jake had better think carefully about his next moves. Jake raised his pistol, sighted down the barrel at the first target, and immediately felt the tremor in his hands. It wasn't fear exactly. He'd faced down charging bulls and broken wild horses that could kill him with a single kick. But this was different. This was about reputation, about his standing in the community, about the fundamental assumptions that governed his understanding of his place in the world. His first shot went wide, kicking up dust 6 inches to the left of the target card. A collective intake of breath from the crowd told him everything he needed to know about how badly he'd missed. "Easy there, Jake," Charlie Drummond called out, his voice carrying the kind of steady calm that came from years of dangerous work. "Just settle down and shoot your gun." But Jake was anything but settled. His second shot was better, clipping the edge of the card, but missing the suit symbol entirely. His third shot hit the fence post 2 inches below the target. By the time he'd fired all 5 rounds, he'd managed to hit exactly 2 cards, and only one of those hits had actually struck the suit marker. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Jake holstered his pistol with movements that were too quick, too jerky, betraying his agitation. He'd been outshot by the minister's wife, and everyone in town had witnessed it. "Well," Mayor Crawford said diplomatically, "that concludes our shooting competition. Mrs. Whitmore, congratulations on exceptional marksmanship." Margaret nodded graciously, but her attention was focused on Jake. She could see the humiliation and anger warring in his expression, and she recognized the dangerous moment they'd reached. Men like Jake didn't handle public embarrassment well, especially when it came at the hands of someone they'd assumed was beneath their notice. "Jake," she said quietly, "you're a fine horseman, and that's no easy skill. We all have different talents." It was a generous gesture, an attempt to give him a face-saving way out of the situation. But Jake was beyond the reach of generosity. His pride had been wounded in front of the entire town, and he was looking for someone to blame. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "There's something wrong here. Nobody just shoots like that, without what?" Dr. Harrison asked, his medical training making him sensitive to the signs of a man approaching a dangerous emotional state. "Without practice," Jake said, seizing on the word. "Lots of practice. The kind of practice that means this was all planned out. This was a setup." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Margaret felt Thomas move. Closer to her, his protective instincts engaged despite his own confusion about what he'd just witnessed. "A setup?" Margaret asked, her voice remaining level despite the unfairness of the charge. "How could I have set up a situation that you initiated?" But Jake was building momentum now, feeding off his own anger. "I don't know how, but I know what I saw. People don't just shoot like that unless they've been practicing for years. Unless they're not what they appear to be." Garrett Hawthorne had been watching the entire exchange with growing discomfort. His casual comment about barn hitting had started this whole mess, and now his employee was making wild accusations against a woman who'd done nothing more than prove herself capable. It was exactly the kind of behavior that gave ranchers a bad reputation with townspeople. "That's enough, Jake," Garrett said firmly. "You lost fair and square. Take it like a man." "No," Jake said, turning to face his boss. "There's something wrong here, and everyone's too polite to say it. Ministers' wives don't shoot like that. They don't even know how to hold a gun proper, let alone put 5 shots through 5 targets at 50 yards. Charlie Drummond stepped forward, his weathered face showing the first signs of real anger. "Son, I've been around guns and shooting for more years than you've been alive. What I just saw was skill, pure and simple. The kind of skill that comes from good teaching and steady nerves." "Good teaching from who?" Jake demanded. "Her preacher husband? I've seen him handle a rifle. He holds it like it's going to bite him." Thomas felt the comment like a physical blow. It was true that he was uncomfortable with firearms, true that his attempts to learn frontier skills had been largely unsuccessful. But having his inadequacies pointed out in front of the entire town, by a man who was essentially calling his wife a liar, was more than he could tolerate. "Mr. Morrison," Thomas said, stepping forward despite his natural reluctance to confront anyone, "I think you've said enough. My wife has done nothing wrong, and your accusations are both unfounded and ungentlemanly." Jake laughed, but it was an ugly sound. Ungentlemanly? Reverend, your wife just outshot me with a rifle she claims she's never seen before. That's not normal. That's not natural. And everyone here knows it, even if they're too polite to say so. What exactly are you suggesting? Dr. Harrison asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers to difficult questions. Jake looked around the crowd, seeing faces that ranged from sympathetic to hostile. He was committed now, too far in to back down. I'm suggesting that maybe we don't know as much about our preacher's wife as we thought we did. Maybe she's not the quiet little church lady she pretends to be. The words fell into the gathering like stones into still water, creating ripples of whispered conversation and exchanged glances. Margaret felt the weight of scrutiny from people she'd considered friends, saw the uncertainty in faces that had been warm and welcoming just an hour earlier. You want to know about my wife shooting? Thomas said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. I'll tell you. She learned from her father, who served with distinction in the Union Army. She's never made any secret of her abilities, and she's never used them for anything but protection when it was necessary. The Union Army, Jake repeated, and there was something in his voice that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Texas had been Confederate territory, and while the war had been over for more than 20 years, the divisions it had created still ran deep in some quarters. Yes, Thomas said defiantly. The Union Army. Her father fought to preserve the United States of America, and he taught his daughter to defend herself because he understood that the frontier could be dangerous for women. A Yankee soldier's daughter, Jake said, and now his voice carried open hostility. Well, that explains a lot, doesn't it? The crowd was dividing now. Margaret could see it happening. Some faces showed anger at Jake's implications, others showed the kind of suspicious consideration that suggested his words were finding fertile ground. The war had ended, but the resentments it had created were still alive in many hearts. Jake Morrison, Mayor Crawford said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, you're walking a dangerous line. This woman is a respected member of our community, and your accusations are both baseless and inflammatory. Are they? Jake asked. How do we know anything about these people? They showed up here 3 years ago with nothing but the clothes on their backs and some story about wanting to serve God. How do we know they are who they say they are? Margaret felt the moment crystallizing around her. She could see the doubt spreading through the crowd, could feel the comfortable assumptions that had governed her life in Clearwater beginning to crumble. She had a choice to make, retreat into the safety of silence and let Jake's accusations poison the air, or stand up for herself and risk revealing truths that might change everything. You want to know who I am? She said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering. I'm the daughter of Sergeant Major William Hayes, who served with the 5th Ohio Infantry throughout the entire war. I learned to shoot because growing up on a homestead in Oklahoma Territory meant learning to defend yourself against wolves, raiders, and anyone else who might threaten your family. I learned to shoot well because my father believed that if you were going to do something, you should do it properly. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I married Thomas because I loved him, and I came to Texas because I believed in his calling to serve this community. I've never pretended to be anything other than what I am, a woman who will do whatever is necessary to protect the people she cares about. Jake started to respond, but Margaret wasn't finished. You want to question my character because I can shoot straight? Fine. But while you're doing that, you might want to ask yourself why you're so threatened by a woman who can do something you can't. You might want to consider what that says about your own character. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He stepped back, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. You can't talk to me like that. I'm not going to stand here and be insulted by somewhat? Charlie Drummond interrupted, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Some woman. Who just proved she's a better shot than you? Some person who's shown more grace and dignity in 10 minutes than you've managed in your entire life. Jake spun to face Charlie, his hand moving instinctively toward his holstered pistol. You stay out of this, old man. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me plenty, Charlie said, not moving but somehow seeming to fill more space. I've seen a lot of men in my time, son. Good ones and bad ones, brave ones and cowards. And I'll tell you something. The measure of a man isn't whether he can outshoot a woman. It's how he handles himself when he finds out he can't. The confrontation was escalating beyond anyone's control. Margaret could see it in the tension of bodies, in the way hands moved closer to weapons, in the electric feeling that preceded violence. She'd seen it before, in the wild days of her childhood when disputes were settled with gunpowder and lead. This has gone far enough, she said, her voice cutting through the growing hostility. Mr. Morrison, you've made your feelings clear. You think I'm some sort of fraud or threat. Fine, but I won't stand here and watch good people get hurt because of your wounded pride. She turned to face the crowd, addressing them directly. I've lived in this town for 3 years. I've worked alongside many of you, prayed with you, celebrated your joys, and mourned your losses. You know who I am, not because of what I can do with a rifle, but because of how I've chosen to live among you. Don't let one man's embarrassment change that. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his medical bag in hand and his expression serious. The Findu. Lady's right. This has gone too far. Jake, you've had your say. Now it's time for you to walk away before someone gets hurt. But Jake was beyond the reach of reason. The humiliation of being outshot, combined with the public support Margaret was receiving, had pushed him past the point of rational behavior. I'm not walking away from anything. This woman has made a fool of me in front of the whole town, and I'm not going to let that stand. Made a fool of you? Margaret asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine puzzlement. How did I make a fool of you? You challenged me, I accepted, and we both did our best. That's not making a fool of anyone. That's just life. Life? Jake laughed bitterly. Life is knowing your place. Life is understanding that there are natural orders that shouldn't be upset. Life is not having some preacher's wife show up and turn everything upside down. The words revealed more than Jake had intended. This wasn't really about shooting or accuracy or even wounded pride. This was about a worldview that couldn't accommodate a woman who refused to stay within the boundaries that men like Jake had drawn for her. Margaret understood this, and she also understood that no amount of reasoning or diplomacy was going to resolve the situation. Jake Morrison had made his choice, and now she had to make hers. Mr. Morrison, she said quietly, I'm sorry that my abilities threaten your sense of how the world should work. But I won't apologize for being who I am, and I won't pretend to be less capable than I am just to make you more comfortable. She turned to Thomas, who had been watching the exchange with a growing alarm. I think we should go home now. Church service can wait for another day. But Jake wasn't finished. You're not going anywhere until we settle this properly. Settle what? Garrett Hawthorne demanded, finally losing his patience entirely. You lost a shooting contest, Jake. That's all that happened here. You lost, and now you're acting like a child about it. I'm acting like a man who won't be humiliated by some woman who doesn't know her place. Jake shot back. That's when Charlie Drummond's patience finally ran out. Son, he said, his voice carrying decades of hard-won authority, you've got about 10 seconds to apologize to this lady and walk away. Because if you don't, I'm going to teach you some manners the hard way. Jake looked at Charlie, saw the steel in the old scout's eyes, and realized that he'd pushed the situation to a point where backing down might be impossible. But advancing meant facing a man who'd survived buffalo hunts, Indian raids, and countless other dangers that Jake had only heard about in stories. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see which way the confrontation would go. Margaret stood in the center of it all, the quiet minister's wife who'd started the morning walking to church, and found herself at the center of a conflict that would define her place in Clearwater for years to come. The next few seconds would determine whether the day ended with handshakes and grudging respect, or with blood in the dust of the town's main street. The 10 seconds that Charlie Drummond had given Jake Morrison stretched like hours. Margaret could feel the tension radiating from every person in the crowd, could see the way men unconsciously shifted their weight and women pulled their children closer. This was the moment when words would either resolve the conflict or prove insufficient to contain it. Jake's hand hovered near his pistol, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Pride warred with self-preservation as he stared into Charlie's weathered features and saw something that made his mouth go dry. Charlie Drummond had the look of a man who'd killed before and would do so again if necessary, without hesitation or regret. "You threatening me, old man?" Jake asked, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments earlier. "I'm offering you a choice," Charlie replied calmly. "You can apologize to the lady and walk away with your dignity intact, or you can find out what happens to men who threaten women under my protection." "Your protection?" Jake laughed, but the sound was strained. "Since when is the preacher's wife under your protection?" "Since the moment she showed more courage and skill than any man in this crowd," Charlie said, "including me." The admission sent a ripple through the watching townspeople. Charlie Drummond was legendary in these parts, a man whose exploits were spoken of in hushed tones. For him to publicly acknowledge that Margaret had surpassed his own abilities was more than mere praise. It was a validation that carried the weight of absolute authority. Mayor Crawford sensed the critical nature of the moment and stepped forward. "Jake Morrison, I'm ordering you to stand down. This confrontation ends now." "You can't order me to do anything," Jake shot back. "You're not a marshal anymore, Crawford. You're just a dirt farmer with a fancy title." The insult to Crawford was a mistake that Jake realized too late. Several men in the crowd had served under Crawford during his law enforcement days, and they didn't appreciate seeing their former leader disrespected. The mood was shifting decidedly against Jake, and he could feel his support evaporating. "That's it," said Bill Hendricks, stepping out of the crowd. At 6 feet 4 inches and weighing close to 250 pounds, Bill was one of the largest men in Clearwater. His farm was successful, his reputation solid, and his opinion carried weight. "Jake, you've run your mouth long enough. Time to shut it." "This doesn't concern you, Hendricks," Jake said, but his voice was weakening. "It concerns all of us," Bill replied. "Mrs. Whitmore has been nothing but kind to this town. She's helped my wife through 2 difficult births, taught my children their letters, and never asked for anything in return. You want to stand there and insult her because she can outshoot you? That says everything about your character and nothing about hers." More voices joined in, a chorus of support for Margaret that seemed to surprise her as much as anyone. Mrs. Patterson spoke up about the meals Margaret had brought when her husband was injured. The schoolteacher mentioned Margaret's volunteer work with children who struggled with reading. Even some of the younger cowboys, men who worked for other ranches, began expressing their disapproval of Jake's behavior. Thomas felt a complex mixture of pride and bewilderment as he listened to the testimonials. He'd known that Margaret was well regarded in the community, but hearing the depth of respect and affection she'd earned was revelatory. More than that, he was beginning to understand that his wife possessed dimensions of character that he'd never fully appreciated. "You see what's happening here, Jake?" Garrett said quietly, moving closer to his employee. "You've turned the whole town against you over nothing. This needs to stop now." But Jake was trapped by his own stubbornness and the public nature of his humiliation. Backing down now would mean admitting he'd been wrong, not just about Margaret's shooting ability, but about his entire approach to the situation. For a man who'd built his identity around being tough and uncompromising, such an admission felt impossible. "I'm not backing down from anything," he said, his voice rising again. "This woman has made a fool of me, and I won't stand for it." Margaret had been listening to the testimonials and counter-arguments with growing sadness. She could see that Jake had painted himself into a corner, and she understood that cornered animals were often the most dangerous. But she also saw an opportunity to end the confrontation without bloodshed. "Mr. Morrison," she said, stepping forward despite Thomas's restraining hand on her arm, "you haven't been made a fool of by anyone but yourself. You challenged me to a shooting contest, and I accepted. I won, you lost. That's all that happened here." She paused, looking directly into his eyes. "But if it helps your pride, I'll tell you something that might put things in perspective. I've been shooting since I was 8 years old. My father started teaching me after my mother was killed by raiders who thought our homestead would be an easy target. I've had 20 years of practice, Mr. Morrison. 20 years of shooting almost every day, because on the frontier, that practice was the difference between life and death." The revelation stunned the crowd into silence. Margaret had never spoken about her mother's death, had never shared the darker details of her childhood. Even Thomas looked shocked. He'd known that her mother had died when Margaret was young, but he'd never pressed for details about the circumstances. "So you see," Margaret continued, "you weren't outshot by some pampered minister's wife who got lucky. You were outshot by someone who learned marksmanship as a survival skill, who practiced it as a necessity, and who's had 2 decades to perfect it. There's no shame in that, Mr. Morrison. There's only shame in refusing to accept it gracefully." Jake stared at her, his mind struggling to process this new information. The image he'd had of Margaret as a soft, sheltered church lady was crumbling, replaced by something far more complex and formidable. A woman who'd learned to shoot because her mother had been murdered, who'd spent her childhood preparing for violence, was not someone who could be easily dismissed or intimidated. "Why didn't you say that before?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because it's not something I like to talk about," Margaret replied. "Because I came to Clearwater to build a new life, not to relive old tragedies. Because I hoped that in a civilized community, my past wouldn't matter as much as my present." Dr. Harrison cleared his throat, his medical training making him sensitive to the emotional undercurrents of the moment. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "this would be a good time for everyone to step back and consider what we've learned today. Mrs. Whitmore has shown remarkable skill and even more remarkable grace under pressure. Mr. Morrison has, well, he's shown you as something else entirely." The diplomatic phrasing didn't hide the doctor's meaning. Jake had revealed himself to be petty, vindictive, and unable to handle defeat with dignity. The contrast with Margaret's composure and generosity was stark and unflattering. Garrett made a decision that had been building throughout the confrontation. "Jake," he said firmly, "you're done. Pack your gear and be off my property by sunset." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "You're firing me? Over this?" "I'm firing you because you've embarrassed yourself, embarrassed me, and embarrassed every man who works for Lazy H," Garrett replied. "I won't have someone representing my ranch who can't show respect to a lady, especially one who's proven herself to be everything you're not." Jake looked around the crowd, searching for support and finding none. Even the men who might have sympathized with his wounded pride were put off by his continued belligerence and his disrespect toward Margaret. He was truly alone now, isolated by his own choices and facing the consequences of his behavior. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. He was making threats he couldn't back up, and everyone present knew it. "Yes, it is," Charlie said quietly. "You can walk away now with what's left of your dignity, or you can keep talking and lose that too. Your choice." For a moment, it seemed as though Jake might choose to escalate the situation further. His hand moved toward his pistol, and several men in the crowd tensed in response. But then he seemed to deflate, the fight going out of him as suddenly as it had built up. "Fine," he said. "But don't think this town has heard the last of Jake Morrison." He turned and stalked away, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. The crowd watched him go, the tension slowly draining out of the air as the immediate threat of violence receded. "Well," Mayor Crawford said after Jake had disappeared around the corner, "that was certainly more exciting than I expected from a Sunday morning." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, the kind of release that follows a near miss with disaster. People began talking among themselves, rehashing the events and expressing their opinions about what had transpired. Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, people who wanted to express their admiration for her shooting and their approval of how she'd handled the confrontation. But she was also acutely aware that the morning's events had changed something fundamental about her place in the community. She was no longer just the quiet minister's wife. She was something else, something that would require a new understanding. Between her and the people of Clearwater. Thomas approached her, his expression a mixture of pride and confusion. "Margaret," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She nodded, understanding that their relationship, too, would need to be redefined in light of what had been revealed. "Yes," she said, "we do." Charlie Drummond appeared at her elbow, the Winchester she'd borrowed still in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, "I wanted to thank you for handling that situation with more class than it deserved. And I wanted to say that if you ever need anything at all, you just let me know." "Thank you, Mr. Drummond," Margaret replied. "Your support meant more than you know." "Call me Charlie," he said with a rare smile. "I think we're past formalities now." Dr. Harrison joined them, his medical bag packed and ready for whatever might come next. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I hope you know that what happened here today wasn't really about shooting. It was about a man who couldn't handle being shown up by someone he thought was beneath him. You handled it perfectly." "I'm not sure about it perfectly," Margaret said. "But I tried to handle it honestly." "That's all any of us can do," Dr. Harrison replied. "Be honest about who we are and let others decide how they want to respond." Garrett Hawthorne approached, his hat in his hands and his expression apologetic. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I owe you an apology. My comment about barn hitting started this whole mess, and then I let my employee make it worse. I'm sorry for both." Margaret studied his face, seeing genuine regret there. "Apology accepted, Mr. Hawthorne. But perhaps in the future you might consider that people aren't always what they appear to be." "Lesson learned," Garrett said. "And if you ever want to give shooting lessons, I've got a few cowboys who could use the instruction." The comment drew laughter from the nearby crowd, breaking some of the remaining tension. Margaret smiled, recognizing the peace offering for what it was. "I'll consider it," she said. "Though I think I've had enough shooting for one day." As the crowd began to disperse, people drifting back to their Sunday routines, Margaret stood with Thomas in the middle of the street where it had all begun. The morning sun was higher now, warming the air and burning off the last of the dew. It felt like a different day entirely from the one that had started with their quiet walk to church. "So," Thomas said finally, 20 years of practice?" 20 years, Margaret confirmed. "I'm sorry I never told you all of it. Some memories are too painful to share easily." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'm beginning to understand that there's a lot about you that I never knew. About your strength, your capabilities, your your courage. Does that frighten you?" Margaret asked, genuine concern in her voice. Thomas considered the question carefully. "It should, I suppose. Everything I thought I knew about my wife has been turned upside down this morning. But no, it doesn't frighten me. It humbles me, maybe. Makes me realize that I married a remarkable woman and spent 3 years treating her like she was ordinary." Margaret took his hand, feeling the calluses that had developed from his efforts to master frontier skills, despite his natural aptitude lying elsewhere. "I never wanted to be anything but ordinary, Thomas. I came here to be your wife and to serve. This community, the shooting, the other skills, they're just part of who I am, not who I want to be. But they are who you are, Thomas said. And after today, everyone in Clearwater knows it. Things are going to be different now. Margaret looked around at the town that had become her home, at the faces of people who had witnessed her transformation from quiet minister's wife to something altogether more complex and formidable. Thomas was right. Things would be different. Now, the question was whether that change would be for better or worse. Different doesn't have to mean bad, she said finally. Maybe it just means being more honest. As they walked home together, Margaret reflected on the morning's events. She'd stood up for herself, proven her capabilities, and earned the respect of her community. But she'd also revealed truths that couldn't be taken back, opened doors that couldn't be closed again. The quiet life she'd built in Clearwater was over. What would replace it remained to be seen. The Whitmore parsonage felt different when Thomas and Margaret returned from their eventful morning. The familiar room seemed smaller somehow, as if the walls could no longer contain the enlarged understanding of who Margaret truly was. Thomas moved through their modest home with the careful steps of a man navigating unfamiliar territory, while Margaret busied herself preparing coffee with hands that showed no trace of the morning's tension. I keep thinking about what you said. Thomas finally broke the silence as they sat across from each other at their small kitchen table. About your mother. Margaret's cup paused halfway to her lips. I know you have questions. I should have told you everything before we married. Not should have, Thomas said gently. Could have when you were ready. I'm beginning to understand that there's a difference between secrecy and privacy. Through their window, they could see townspeople passing by, many slowing their pace to glance toward the parsonage. Word of the morning's events was spreading through Clearwater like ripples in a pond, and Margaret suspected that their quiet Sunday afternoon was about to become much less quiet. They're curious, she observed, noting the increased foot traffic. Can you blame them? Thomas asked. This morning they thought they knew the minister's wife. Now they've discovered they were living next door to Annie Oakley. Margaret smiled despite herself, hardly that skilled. Skilled enough to make an impression, Thomas replied. Charlie Drummond doesn't hand out compliments lightly, and Garrett Hawthorne firing Jake on the spot. That speaks volumes about how seriously they took what happened. As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at their front door. Thomas answered to find Mrs. Eleanor Patterson from the general store, holding a covered dish and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor said, bustling past Thomas without invitation. I brought you some of my apple cake. Thought you might need something sweet after such a morning. Margaret accepted the dish graciously, recognizing the gesture for what it was, not just kindness, but an excuse to satisfy curiosity about the woman who had shocked the entire town. That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Patterson. Would you like some? Coffee. Oh, I couldn't impose, Eleanor said, already settling into a chair. Though if you insist, I suppose I could stay for just a moment. As Margaret poured coffee, Eleanor's questions began in earnest. Is it true that your father was a soldier? And that you've been shooting since you were a child? Mercy, I had no idea. You've always seemed so ... Well, so ... double quotes, ordinary, Margaret suggested. Peaceful, Eleanor corrected diplomatically. Like butter wouldn't melt in your mouth. But this morning, goodness. You handled that rifle like you were born to it. Before Margaret could respond, another knock interrupted. This time it was Dr. Harrison, accompanied by Mayor Crawford and, somewhat surprisingly, Charlie Drummond. Ladies, gentlemen, Dr. Harrison said as they were invited in. I hope we're not intruding, but we felt it important to discuss this morning's events and their implications. Thomas gestured for everyone to sit, though their small parlor was crowded with the additional visitors. Margaret sensed that this was more than a social call. There was an official quality to the gathering that made her wary. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mayor Crawford began, "what happened today has raised some questions that the town council feels need to be addressed." "What kind of questions?" Thomas asked, his protective instincts engaging. "Nothing accusatory," Dr. Harrison quickly interjected. "But practical matters. Mrs. Whitmore's demonstrated abilities open up certain possibilities that we hadn't previously considered." Charlie Drummond leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped between his knees. "What they're dancing around," he said bluntly, "is that this town could use someone with your skills, ma'am. In an official capacity." Margaret set down her coffee cup carefully. "I'm not sure I understand." "Clearwater's grown considerably in the past few years," Mayor Crawford explained. "We've got more businesses, more people passing through, more money changing hands. With that growth comes certain security concerns. We've had 3 attempted robberies this year," Dr. Harrison added. "The bank, Patterson's store, and the Silver Dollar. We were lucky that nothing serious came of them. But it's only a matter of time before our luck runs out." Thomas was beginning to understand where the conversation was heading. "You're talking about law enforcement." "Exactly," Crawford said. "I've got the authority to appoint deputies, but finding qualified candidates has been challenging. Most men with the necessary skills are either already employed or not interested in small-town work." Eleanor Patterson had been listening with growing excitement. "You mean Margaret could be a deputy, a female deputy?" "There's no law against it," Crawford replied. "Unusual, certainly, but not illegal. And after this morning's demonstration, I think we can all agree that Mrs. Whitmore possesses the necessary qualifications." Margaret felt the weight of their expectations settling on her shoulders. "I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not sure I'm suited for law enforcement. I'm a minister's wife, not a gunfighter." "You're a woman who can keep her head under pressure and handle a firearm better than most men," Charlie said. "In my experience, those are the most important qualifications for the job." Thomas was struggling with conflicting emotions. Pride in his wife's capabilities warred with concern for her safety and uncertainty about how such a role would affect their ministry. "This is a lot to consider," he said carefully. "Of course it is," Dr. Harrison agreed. "We're not asking for an immediate answer. But we wanted Mrs. Whitmore to know that the option exists should she choose to pursue it." Margaret looked around the room at the faces watching her expectantly. These were people she'd served and worked alongside for 3 years, people who had just witnessed her completely redefine herself in the space of a morning. She could see that they were offering her something unprecedented, not just a job, but a chance to use abilities that she'd kept hidden for most of her adult life. What would the duties involve? She asked, and Thomas recognized the tone in her voice. She was seriously considering the offer. "Routine patrols, investigating minor crimes, backing up the sheriff when needed," Crawford explained. "Most of the work would be preventive. Your presence alone would likely deter most troublemakers." "And the pay?" Margaret asked practically. $50 a month, plus expenses," Crawford replied. "It's not a fortune, but it would supplement the church's income significantly." Thomas couldn't deny that the financial aspect was attractive. The church's contributions barely covered their basic needs, and an additional $50 monthly would make a substantial difference in their quality of life. Eleanor Patterson had been growing more excited throughout the conversation. "Just think," she said, "Clearwater could have the first woman deputy in the territory. People would come from all over just to see her." "That's exactly what I'm worried about," Margaret sighed quietly. "I don't want to be a curiosity or a tourist attraction." "You wouldn't be," Charlie assured her. "Serious lawmen would respect your abilities, and troublemakers would learn to fear them. The novelty would wear off quickly once people realized you were just doing your job." Another knock at the door interrupted the discussion. Thomas answered to find a young boy from the telegraph office holding a message form. "Wire for Mrs. Whitmore," the boy said breathlessly. "Came in urgent from Austin." Margaret accepted the telegram with trembling hands, her mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. But as she read the brief message, her expression shifted from worry to amazement. "What is it?" Thomas asked. "It's from the territorial governor's office," Margaret said slowly. "They want to discuss my demonstrated expertise in marksmanship and crisis management for a potential position with the territorial militia." The room fell silent. A telegram from the governor's office was not something that happened in Clearwater on an ordinary day, and its arrival just hours after Margaret's shooting demonstration seemed almost impossible to believe. How did they find out so quickly? Dr. Harrison asked. Charlie Drummond looked uncomfortable. "That might be my fault," he admitted. "I sent a wire to an old friend in Austin after the shooting. Told him about what I'd witnessed. Didn't expect it to reach the governor's office." "So fast? What kind of friend?" Crawford asked suspiciously. "The kind who works in territorial security," Charlie replied. "Texas has been having problems with organized outlaw gangs, and they're always looking for qualified people to help deal with the situation." Margaret stared at the telegram, trying to process the implications. In the span of a few hours, she'd gone from being the quiet minister's wife to having job offers from both the local government and the territorial authorities. "This is moving too fast," Thomas said, voicing what everyone was thinking. Margaret needs time to consider her options without pressure from anyone. "Of course," Mayor Crawford agreed, though Margaret could see the disappointment in his face. "We don't want to rush such an important decision." Eleanor Patterson was practically vibrating with excitement. "Either way, this is the most exciting thing that's happened in Clearwater since the railroad came through." After their visitors left, Thomas and Margaret sat in the gathering dusk of their parlor, the telegram lying on the table between them like an unexploded bomb. "A week ago, my biggest worry was whether Mrs. Henderson's chickens were getting into the Sawyer's garden again," Margaret said with a shake of her head. "Now I'm being offered positions that I never imagined possible. What do you want to do?" Thomas asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the town that had become her home. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "For so long, I've tried to be the woman I thought you needed, the woman this community expected. But today showed me that maybe I'd been hiding parts of myself that could actually be useful." "You've never hidden anything from me," Thomas protested. "Haven't I?" Margaret asked gently. "When was the last time I mentioned my father's military service? When did I ever talk about the skills he taught me? I let you believe I was helpless with firearms because I thought that's what you wanted." Thomas considered this, recognizing the truth in her words. "Maybe I did want that at first. It made me feel more necessary, I suppose. But after today, seeing how you handled yourself, how the community responded to you, I think I was wrong to want you to be less than you are. The question is whether Clearwater is ready for who I really am," Margaret said. "Jake Morrison certainly wasn't." "Jake Morrison is gone," Thomas reminded her. "And everyone else seems quite ready to embrace the real Margaret Whitmore." "But what about the church?" Margaret asked. "What about your ministry? Having a wife who works in law enforcement isn't exactly traditional for a minister's family." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "I think," he said finally, "that maybe it's time for both of us to stop worrying so much about what's traditional and start thinking about what's right." Margaret looked at her husband with new appreciation. "You really wouldn't mind having a wife who carries a badge instead of just a prayer book?" "I married you because I loved your strength, your intelligence, and your courage," Thomas said. "If I was too blind to see all the ways those qualities could manifest, that's my failing, not yours." That evening, as Clearwater settled into its usual Sunday night quiet, word of the day's events continued to spread. In the Silver Dollar, Cowboys from various ranches debated the implications of having a woman deputy. At the general store, the women of the town discussed Margaret's hidden past and speculated about her future. In the parsonage, a minister and his wife talked long into the night about dreams deferred and possibilities suddenly within reach. By morning, Margaret had made her decision. She would accept Mayor Crawford's offer to become Clearwater's first deputy, but she would also respond to the governor's telegram and explore what opportunities might exist at the territorial level. She had spent 3 years being less than she was capable of being, and the events of Sunday morning had shown her that such self-limitation served no one. The quiet minister's wife was gone, replaced by someone far more complex and capable. Clearwater would have to adjust to this new reality, just as Margaret herself was adjusting to the possibilities that lay ahead. The woman who had once hidden her abilities behind a facade of domestic tranquility was about to discover just how far those abilities could take her in a world that was finally ready to acknowledge what she had always been capable of doing. Monday morning brought an unusual bustle to Clearwater's main street. Word of Margaret's shooting demonstration had spread beyond the town limits overnight, carried by cowboys heading to neighboring ranches and travelers passing through on their way to larger settlements. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, a steady stream of curious visitors was already making its way into town. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the increased activity with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. She'd never intended to become the center of attention, but the reality of small-town life meant that extraordinary events became public property almost immediately. Second thoughts? Thomas asked, joining her at the window with 2 cups of coffee. Many thoughts, Margaret replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. But not second thoughts, if that makes sense. At precisely 9 o'clock, as they'd arranged the previous evening, Mayor Crawford arrived at the parsonage accompanied by Dr. Harrison and a man Margaret didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and lean, with the kind of bearing that suggested military or law enforcement experience. "Mrs. Whitmore, Reverend," Crawford said as they were welcomed inside, "I'd like you to meet Captain Robert Sterling. He's been serving as sheriff for the Northern District, and he came down overnight after hearing about yesterday's events." Captain Sterling removed his hat and nodded respectfully to both Margaret and Thomas. "Ma'am, Reverend, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt it important to meet you personally before offering any opinions about the deputy position." Margaret studied Sterling's face, noting the intelligent eyes and the careful way he carried himself. "You have reservations about a woman deputy, Captain?" "I have reservations about anyone I haven't personally evaluated," Sterling replied diplomatically. "Gender is less important than competence, and competence is something that needs to be demonstrated under pressure. She demonstrated it yesterday," Dr. Harrison pointed out. "She demonstrated marksmanship," Sterling corrected. "That's one skill among many that law enforcement requires. There's a difference between hitting targets and dealing with armed criminals who shoot back." Thomas felt a familiar protective urge, but he also recognized that Sterling was asking legitimate questions. "What kind of evaluation did you have in mind, Captain?" "Nothing unreasonable," Sterling assured him. "But if Mrs. Whitmore is serious about this position, she should understand what she'd be getting into. Law enforcement isn't just about shooting. It's about making quick decisions under pressure, dealing with violent and unpredictable people, and maintaining authority in situations where your life might depend on others respecting your badge." Margaret set down her coffee cup and looked directly at Sterling. "What do you propose?" "A few practical scenarios," Sterling said. "Nothing dangerous, but situations that would test your judgment and your ability to maintain control. If you're comfortable with that." "I'm comfortable with it," Margaret replied without hesitation. Crawford looked pleased. "Excellent. We can set up the evaluations this afternoon, if that suits everyone." "Actually," Sterling said, "I'd prefer to start immediately." Real situations don't wait for convenient scheduling. As if on cue, the sound of raised voices drifted through the open window from the direction of the main street. Sterling's expression sharpened, and he moved to look outside. "Well," he said, "it appears we have our first scenario." Through the window, they could see a crowd gathering around two men who were engaged in an increasingly heated argument. One was Frank Patterson from the general store, the other a stranger whose dusty clothes and travel-worn appearance suggested he'd ridden hard to reach Clearwater. "That's Ben Murphy," Dr. Harrison said, recognizing the stranger. "He's got a small spread about 20 miles east of here. Haven't seen him in town for months." The argument was escalating, with Murphy gesturing angrily while Patterson backed away, clearly trying to avoid confrontation. Other townspeople were beginning to gather, drawn by the commotion but uncertain about how to intervene. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sterling said quietly, "this is your chance to show me what you're made of. How would you handle this situation?" Margaret studied the scene outside, noting the positions of the various people, the body language of the two men, and the potential for the situation to spiral out of control. "First, I'd need to understand what they're arguing about." "And how?" "Would you find out?" "By talking to them," Margaret said simply. "But carefully and from a position where I could react if things went badly." Sterling nodded approvingly. "Show me." Margaret retrieved her shawl and stepped outside, with Sterling Crawford and the others following at a discreet distance. As they approached the crowd, fragments of the argument became audible. "Told you last month that payment was coming. Murphy was saying, his voice strained with desperation. "And I told you that I can't extend credit indefinitely," Patterson replied, his tone sympathetic but firm. "I've got bills to pay too, Ben." Margaret positioned herself where she could see both men clearly while maintaining an escape route if needed. "Gentlemen," she said in a voice that carried clearly without being loud, "is there something I can help you with?" Both men turned to look at her, Murphy's face showing surprise and Patterson's relief. "Mrs. Whitmore," Patterson said quickly, "Ben here is having some financial difficulties, and we're trying to work out a payment arrangement." Murphy's expression darkened. "It's none of her business, Frank. This is between you and me." "Actually," Margaret said calmly, "when it's happening on the main street and disturbing the peace, it becomes everyone's business. Mr. Murphy, isn't it? I don't believe we've met." Murphy looked her up and down dismissively. "No, we haven't. And I don't see what the preacher's wife has to do with my business affairs." Margaret could feel Sterling watching her carefully, evaluating how she handled the challenge to her authority. "What I have to do with it is that Mayor Crawford has asked me to help keep the peace in Clearwater. That includes making sure disagreements don't turn into something more serious." "You?" Murphy laughed harshly. "Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I've got real problems to deal with." "What kind of problems?" Margaret asked, ignoring the dismissive tone. "Maybe there's a solution that works for everyone." Patterson stepped forward. "Ben's ranch has been hit by rustlers 3 times in the past 2 months. He's lost most of his herd and can't pay what he owes for supplies." The information changed Margaret's understanding of the situation completely. Murphy wasn't just a difficult customer. He was a desperate man facing the loss of everything he'd worked for. "I'm sorry to hear about your losses, Mr. Murphy," she said sincerely. "Rustling is a serious crime. Have you reported it to the territorial authorities?" Murphy's laugh was bitter. "Reported it? Lady, the territorial marshal is spread so thin he might get around to investigating sometime next year. By then, I'll be ruined." Margaret felt the pieces of the situation clicking into place. What if there was a way to deal with the rustlers? More directly? "What do you mean?" Murphy asked suspiciously. "I mean, what if Clearwater had its own law enforcement that could respond immediately to crimes like rustling?" Sterling watched with growing interest as Margaret smoothly shifted the conversation from conflict resolution to problem solving. She was demonstrating exactly the kind of thinking that effective law enforcement required. "You talking about vigilante justice?" Murphy asked. "I'm talking about legitimate law enforcement," Margaret replied. "With proper authority and proper procedures." Patterson looked confused. "Margaret, we don't have that kind of law enforcement in Clearwater." "We could," Margaret said, looking directly at Murphy. "Mr. Murphy, what if I told you that help might be available sooner than you think?" "I'd say you're full of fancy talk and short on practical solutions," Murphy replied. But there was hope in his voice despite the harsh words. Margaret made a call. She made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "What if I rode out to your ranch this afternoon and took a look at the situation? Maybe there's something that can be done." The crowd that had gathered was listening intently now, sensing that something significant was happening. Murphy stared at Margaret as if she'd sprouted wings. You're going to ride out and deal with rustlers?" "I'm going to assess the situation," Margaret corrected, "and determine what kind of response might be appropriate." Sterling stepped forward, his evaluation clearly complete. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think that's an excellent idea. In fact, I'd like to accompany you, if you don't mind." Murphy looked back and forth between Margaret and Sterling, beginning to understand that he'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple debt dispute. "Who are you?" he asked Sterling. "Captain Robert Sterling, Territorial Sheriff's Department," Sterling replied, producing his badge. "And Mrs. Whitmore is about to become Clearwater's first deputy sheriff." The announcement sent a ripple of excitement through the watching crowd. Margaret felt the weight of the moment, understanding that Sterling had just publicly committed her to the position she'd been considering. "Is that official?" she asked Sterling quietly. "As of right now, yes," Sterling replied. "Mayor Crawford, do you have a badge for Deputy Whitmore?" Crawford produced a silver star from his coat pocket, clearly having come prepared for this possibility. "I do indeed." The badge pinning ceremony was impromptu but significant. As Crawford attached the star to Margaret's dress, the crowd burst into spontaneous applause. Even Murphy seemed impressed despite himself. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Clearwater's got itself a lady deputy." "Deputy Whitmore," Margaret corrected with a smile. "And our first order of business is going to be dealing with your rustling problem." The transformation was remarkable. What had started as a heated argument between two desperate men had become Margaret's first official act as a law enforcement officer. Sterling watched with obvious approval as she seamlessly took control of the situation. "Mr. Murphy," Margaret said, "I'll need you to show me exactly where the rustling has been taking place. Captain Sterling and I will ride out with you this afternoon and develop a plan for catching whoever's responsible." "You really think you can help?" Murphy asked, and the hope in his voice was unmistakable. "I think we can try," Margaret replied. "That's what law enforcement is supposed to do, protect people's property and bring criminals to justice." Patterson looked relieved. "Ben, does this mean we can work out some arrangement for your account? Maybe a payment plan based on recovering your cattle?" Murphy nodded eagerly. "If the deputy here can really help me get my herd back, I'll be able to pay what I owe and then some." As the crowd began to disperse, people stopping to congratulate Margaret on her appointment and wish her luck with her first case, Sterling pulled her aside. "That was well handled," he said approvingly. "You diffused a potential conflict, identified the real problem, and took immediate action to solve it. Those are exactly the instincts a good lawman needs." "It felt natural," Margaret admitted. "More natural than I expected." "That's because you're suited for this work," Sterling said. "The shooting exhibition yesterday showed your technical skills, but this morning showed something more important, your judgment." Thomas approached, having watched the entire exchange with amazement. "Deputy Whitmore," he said with obvious pride, "it appears you found your calling." Margaret looked at the badge on her dress, feeling its weight both physically and symbolically. It appears I have. The rest of the morning was spent in preparation for the ride to Murphy's ranch. Sterling provided Margaret with basic information about rustling patterns in the territory, while Murphy described the specifics of his situation. The rustlers had been hitting his property systematically, taking cattle in small groups to avoid detection, but always managing to stay one step ahead of any pursuit. They know the country, Murphy explained as they prepared to ride out, and they seem to know when I'm away from the ranch. It's like they're watching my movements. That suggests local knowledge, Sterling observed. Rustlers who operate this efficiently usually have inside information. Margaret was checking her equipment, making sure she had everything needed for what might become a dangerous investigation. Charlie Drummond had provided her with an excellent rifle and a reliable horse, while Dr. Harrison had insisted she carry medical supplies in case anyone was injured. "You ready for this, Deputy?" Sterling asked as they prepared to mount up. Margaret looked back at Clearwater, at the town that had become her home and was now her responsibility to protect. Less than 24 hours earlier, she'd been a minister's wife walking to church. Now she was a law enforcement officer about to investigate her first case. "I'm ready," she said, and surprised herself by meaning it completely as they rode out of town. With Murphy leading the way and Sterling beside her, Margaret felt a sense of rightness that she hadn't experienced in years. This was who she was meant to be, who she had always been beneath the layers of expectation and convention that had hidden her true nature. The quiet minister's wife was gone forever, replaced by Deputy Margaret Whitmore, and Clearwater would never be the same. The ride to Murphy's ranch took them through 20 miles of Texas countryside that alternated between rolling grassland and rocky hills dotted with mesquite and oak. Margaret found herself studying the terrain with new eyes, no longer seeing it as scenery, but as tactical ground where criminals might hide and honest ranchers might be ambushed. Murphy's property sat in a natural bowl formed by low hills, with a creek running through the center that provided water for cattle and a modest farmhouse. What should have been a thriving operation showed clear signs of distress: broken fences, empty pastures, and a general air of abandonment that spoke to months of harassment. "This is where they hit me the first time," Murphy said, pointing to a section of fence that had been crudely repaired. "Took about 30 head right through that gap. By the time I discovered it, the trail was already cold." Sterling dismounted and examined the fence line, his experienced eye taking in details that might escape casual observation. "Professional work," he commented. "They cut the wire cleanly, drove the cattle through, then replaced the fence to delay discovery. These aren't opportunistic thieves, they're organized." Margaret was studying the surrounding hills, noting potential vantage points and escape routes. "How long between raids?" she asked Murphy. "About 3 weeks," Murphy replied. "Just long enough for me to think maybe they'd moved on, then they'd hit again." "Always the same area?" "No, that's the thing. They've hit 3 different sections of the ranch, always the spots that are hardest to watch from the house." Sterling and Margaret exchanged glances. The pattern suggested either extensive scouting or inside knowledge of Murphy's routines and vulnerabilities. "Who else knows your ranch this well?" Margaret asked. Murphy's face darkened. "That's what's been eating at me. The only people who know this property like that are folks I've trusted for years." "Such as?" "Well, there's Tom Bradley. He's been helping with the cattle for the better part of 5 years. Good man, reliable. Then there's the Martinez family. They've been doing seasonal work for me since I started this place." And double quotes Murphy hesitated. "And?" Sterling prompted. "And Jake Morrison worked here briefly last spring, before he went to work for Garrett Hawthorne." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Jake Morrison?" "The same Jake Morrison who was fired from the Lazy H yesterday." "That's him," Murphy confirmed. "Worked for about 3 months, learned the ranch inside and out. Left suddenly one day, said he'd found better work with Hawthorne." Sterling was already putting the pieces together. And when did the rustling start? About 2 months after Jake left, Murphy said. The implications hitting him. You think he's involved? It's a possibility we need to investigate, Margaret sighed carefully. But we shouldn't jump to conclusions without evidence. They spent the next hour examining the other sites where cattle had been stolen, and the pattern became increasingly clear. Each location offered excellent cover for rustlers, clear escape routes, and minimal visibility from the main ranch buildings. Someone with intimate knowledge of the property had selected these spots carefully. There's something else, Murphy said as they prepared to examine the most recent theft site. Each time they hit, it was on a day when I was away from the ranch. Town business, supply runs, that sort of thing. Who knew about your trips? Sterling asked. Anyone who saw me in town, I suppose. I'm not exactly secretive about my business. Margaret was beginning to form a theory, but she needed more information before sharing it. Mr. Murphy, has anyone been asking questions about your ranch lately? Showing unusual interest in your operations? Murphy thought for a moment. Funny you should ask. About a week ago, a fellow came by claiming to be interested in buying cattle. Said he represented some buyers from Kansas. Asked a lot of questions. About my herd size, grazing areas, that sort of thing. Did you recognize him? Never seen him before. But he knew an awful lot about ranching for someone who was supposedly just a buyer. Sterling's expression had grown grim. Can you describe him? Average height, dark hair, scar on his left hand from what looked like a rope burn. Rode a good horse, well-maintained gear. Talked like an educated man, but he had the look of someone who'd done hard work. Margaret felt the pieces clicking into place. Mr. Murphy, I think your cattle thefts are part of something much larger than random. Rustling. What do you mean? I mean you're dealing with an organized operation that scouts targets, gathers intelligence, and strikes when the risk is lowest. This isn't the work of desperate cowboys looking for easy money. It's a business. Sterling nodded in agreement. Deputy Whitmore is right. We've been tracking similar operations throughout the territory. Highly organized, well-informed, and very difficult to catch. So what do we do? Murphy asked. Margaret had been thinking about this throughout their investigation. We set a trap. Both men looked at her with interest. If they've been watching your movements and timing their raids accordingly, we use that against them. You make it known in town that you'll be away on a specific day, maybe a cattle buying trip to San Antonio. Meanwhile, we position ourselves to watch the ranch and catch them in the act. That's risky, Sterling pointed out. If they're as organized as we think, they might be watching for exactly that kind of setup. Which is why we need to make it look completely natural, Margaret replied. Murphy makes his usual preparations for a business trip, follows his normal routine, but instead of actually leaving, he circles back and joins us in a concealed position. Murphy was warming to the idea. There's an old line shack on the north ridge that overlooks most of the ranch. If we positioned ourselves there, we could see anyone approaching the cattle. And if they do show up? Sterling asked. We identify them, gather evidence, and make arrests, Margaret said simply. Clean and legal. Sterling studied her face, seeing the determination there. You realize that if we're right about this being an organized operation, we could be facing multiple armed men who won't hesitate to shoot their way out of trouble. I realize that, Margaret replied. Do you think I'm not capable of handling such a situation? On the contrary, Sterling said with a smile. I think you're probably better equipped for it than most deputies I've worked with. I just wanted to make sure you understood the stakes. They spent another hour working out the details of their plan. Murphy would return to town, make a show of preparing for a cattle buying trip, and let it be known that he'd be away for several days. Meanwhile, Margaret and Sterling would position themselves at the line shack with supplies and weapons, ready to observe and intervene if rustlers appeared. When do you want to do this? Murphy asked. Soon, Margaret said. The longer we wait, the more time they have to become suspicious or move on to other targets. How about this coming Friday? Sterling suggested. That gives us 3 days to prepare and get into position. As they rode back toward Clearwater, Margaret found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in just 2 days. Sunday morning, she'd been walking to church as the minister's wife. Monday evening, she was planning her first major law enforcement operation. Second thoughts? Sterling asked, apparently reading her expression. Many thoughts, Margaret replied, echoing her earlier conversation with Thomas. But they're not second thoughts. Good, because I have a feeling this case is going to establish your reputation one way or another. What do you mean? If we catch these rustlers, you'll be known throughout the territory as the deputy who broke up an organized cattle theft ring. If we don single quotes T ... double quotes, Sterling shrugged. If we don't, I'll be known as the woman who got in over her head, Margaret finished. Exactly. No pressure. Margaret laughed despite the seriousness of the situation. Captain Sterling, I think you underestimate what I've been living with my entire life. Pressure is nothing new. They reached Clearwater as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Margaret why she'd fallen in love with Texas in the first place. The town was busier than usual, with several new faces visible on the plaza, streets, and in front of the businesses. Word's getting out about our new deputy, Sterling observed, noting the strangers. Some of these folks probably rode in just to get a look at you. Margaret felt a familiar flutter of discomfort at being the center of attention, but she was learning to accept that visibility came with the badge she now wore. Thomas was waiting for them at the parsonage, along with Dr. Harrison and Mayor Crawford. All 3 men looked anxious to hear about the day's investigation. Well? Crawford asked as soon as they dismounted. What did you find? Margaret looked at Sterling, who nodded for her to take the lead. We found evidence of an organized rustling operation that's been systematically targeting Mr. Murphy's ranch. We also have a plan to catch them. She outlined their strategy while the men listened with growing excitement and concern. The prospect of breaking up a cattle theft ring was appealing, but the dangers involved were obvious to everyone. Margaret, Thomas said quietly when she'd finished, this sounds extremely dangerous. Most worthwhile things are, she replied. Gently, but Captain Sterling will be with me, and will have every advantage except numbers. What if there are more of them than you expect? Dr. Harrison asked practically. What if they're better armed or more desperate than you anticipate? Then we'll adapt, Margaret said with a confidence that surprised even her. That's what law enforcement officers do. We deal with whatever situation presents itself. Crawford was nodding approvingly. Deputy Whitmore, I have to say that your first day on the job has exceeded my highest expectations. To go from appointment to major investigation in a single day is remarkable. The job found me, Margaret said simply. I just responded to it. Sterling pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. I need to send some telegrams to the territorial office. Let them know what we've discovered. If this is part of the larger operation we've been tracking, they'll want to coordinate with our efforts. What kind of coordination? Margaret asked. Backup, for one thing. If we're successful, we'll want to interrogate any prisoners thoroughly. And if we're unsuccessful, ... Sterling didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. After Sterling left to send his telegrams, Margaret found herself alone with Thomas for the first time since morning. The day's events felt surreal, as if she'd been living someone else's life. How do you feel? Thomas asked as they sat together in their small parlor. Different, Margaret said honestly. Like I've been wearing clothes that didn't fit properly for years, and suddenly undressed correctly. No regrets? None, Margaret said without hesitation. For the first time since we moved to Clearwater, I feel like I'm using all of who I am instead of just the parts that seemed appropriate. Thomas reached across and took her hand. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry that it took so long for me to understand who you really are. You're understanding now, Margaret said. That's what matters. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Thomas answered to find Charlie Drummond standing outside, holding a gun belt and holster. "Evening, folks," Charlie said. Thought Deputy Whitmore might need proper equipment for her new position. The gun belt was beautifully crafted leather, obviously expensive and designed for serious use. The holster was positioned for a quick draw, and the belt had loops for extra ammunition. "Mr. Drummond, this is too generous," Margaret protested. "Nonsense," Charlie replied. "Can't have our deputy walking around unarmed. Besides, after Friday, you're going to need something better than a borrowed rifle." Margaret accepted the gift with gratitude, recognizing both the practical value and the symbolic significance. Charlie Drummond was publicly acknowledging her as a legitimate law enforcement officer, worthy of professional equipment. "There's something else," Charlie said, his tone becoming more serious. "I've been asking around about that Jake Morrison fellow. Turns out he's been seen in some questionable company since Garrett fired him." "What kind of company?" Margaret asked. "The kind that doesn't have fixed addresses and seems to have plenty of money, despite no visible means of employment," Charlie replied grimly. The implications were clear. Jake Morrison's involvement in the rustling operation was looking more likely by the hour. "We'll be ready for him," Margaret said, and as she spoke the words, she realized she meant them completely. Friday was going to be a day that defined not just her career, but her entire understanding of who she was meant to be. Friday dawn broke crisp and clear across the Texas landscape. Margaret crouched in the old line shack overlooking Murphy's ranch. Her new gun belt settled comfortably around her waist and Sterling's field glasses in her hands. They'd been in position since before sunrise, watching the empty pastures below for any sign of movement. "Still hard to believe this all started with a church walk," Sterling murmured, adjusting his position behind a fallen log that provided excellent cover. Margaret smiled grimly, scanning the approaches to the cattle grazing area. "My grandmother used to say that life has a way of putting you where you're supposed to be, whether you plan it or not." Murphy had played his part perfectly, making a show in town preparing for his cattle buying trip before secretly circling back to join them. He lay concealed 50 yards to their left, armed with his hunting rifle and burning with the desire to catch whoever had been systematically destroying his livelihood. The first sign of trouble came at mid-morning. Margaret spotted dust rising from the eastern approach. Too much and too organized to be a natural wildlife movement. "Company," she whispered, passing the field glasses to Sterling. Through the lenses, 4 riders became visible, moving with the careful precision of men who knew exactly what they were doing. Leading them was a figure that made Sterling's jaw tighten. "Jake Morrison," he confirmed quietly. "And 3 others I don't recognize." Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but her hands remained steady. "Same plan, same plan. We let them get to work, gather evidence, then make our move." The rustlers approached Murphy's cattle with practiced efficiency. 2 men began cutting fence wire while Jake and the 4th rider started separating cattle from the main herd. Their movements were smooth and coordinated, clearly the result of extensive experience. "Professional operation," Sterling observed. "These men have done this dozens of times." Margaret was studying Jake's companions, noting their weapons and positioning. "The one on the paint horse keeps watching the approaches. That's their lookout. Good eye. When we move, he'll be the most dangerous." They watched for another 20 minutes as the rustlers efficiently gathered nearly 30 head of cattle. Margaret found herself admiring their skill, even as she prepared to arrest them. These weren't desperate amateurs. They were talented criminals who had chosen the wrong profession. "Time to go," Sterling said as the rustlers began driving the stolen cattle toward the eastern hills. Margaret checked her weapons one final time, then signaled to Murphy. The plan was simple but required precise timing. Sterling would approach from the north, Margaret from the south, and Murphy would block the eastern escape route. If everything went according to plan, they'd have the rustlers surrounded before any shots were fired. Margaret moved through the scrub brush with the silent efficiency her father had taught her 20 years earlier. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to bring her closer without alerting her quarry. The skills that had once been necessary for survival were now serving the cause of justice. She reached her position just as Sterling emerged from his cover, his badge visible and his rifle ready. Territorial law. He called out in a voice that carried clearly across the pasture. "Stop where you are and raise your hands." The rustler's response was immediate and violent. Jake Morrison drew his pistol and fired at Sterling, while his companions scattered in different directions, seeking cover and return fire positions. Margaret stepped out of concealment, her own weapon trained on the lookout, who was wheeling his horse toward her position. "Drop your weapons," she commanded. The man's response was to swing his rifle toward her, a mistake that proved fatal to his freedom. Margaret's shot took him cleanly in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle without killing him. Her father's training had emphasized precision over brutality, and 20 years later, that precision served her well. The gunfight lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes contained a lifetime of decisive action. Sterling wounded one rustler and captured another, while Murphy managed to block the escape route and force the remaining criminal to surrender. Jake Morrison, seeing his operation collapsing around him, made a desperate attempt to shoot his way out. Margaret found herself face to face with the man who had mocked and challenged her just 5 days earlier. Jake's face was twisted with rage and desperation as he raised his pistol toward her. "You should have minded your own business," he snarled. "This is my business," Margaret replied calmly, her own weapon steady in her hands. "Drop the gun, Jake." For a moment, time seemed suspended between them. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger, and Margaret knew that the next few seconds would determine whether she went home to Thomas or became another casualty of frontier justice. Jake's shot went wide, spoiled by the wound Sterling had inflicted on his gun arm. Margaret's return shot was devastatingly accurate, striking Jake's weapon and sending it spinning from his grasp. He fell to his knees, clutching his injured hand and staring at her with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "It's over, Jake," Margaret said quietly, approaching him with her weapon still drawn. The rustling, the threats, all of it. The aftermath was swift and efficient. Sterling's telegrams had brought territorial marshals who arrived just as the last shots were fired, and the rustlers found themselves facing federal charges that would put them away for years. Murphy's cattle were recovered unharmed, and evidence found in Jake's saddlebags linked the operation to similar thefts throughout Central Texas. As they rode back toward Clearwater with their prisoners, Sterling shook his head in amazement. 5 days ago, you were walking to church. Today, you broke up a cattle theft ring that's been operating for months. That might be a record. Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering the transformation she'd undergone. "I think I was always this person," she said finally. "I just needed the right circumstances to become her." The town of Clearwater turned out in force to welcome their returning deputy. Word of the successful operation had preceded them, and Margaret found herself facing a crowd that looked at her with new respect and admiration. These were people who had known her as the quiet minister's wife, but who now saw her as someone capable of protecting their community and their way of life. Thomas stood at the front of the crowd, his face glowing with pride as Margaret dismounted and handed her prisoners over to the waiting marshals. When their eyes met, she saw complete acceptance and love there, without reservation or qualification. "Deputy Whitmore," Mayor Crawford said formally, "on behalf of the town of Clearwater, I want to thank you for your service and congratulate you on the successful completion of your first major case." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, Mrs. Patterson beaming with pride, Dr. Harrison nodding approvingly, Charlie Drummond watching with quiet satisfaction, and dozens of others who had witnessed her journey from church lady to law officer. "Thank you," she said simply. "But this was just the beginning. There's a lot more work to be done." 6 months later, Deputy Margaret Whitmore had become a legend throughout the territory. Her combination of exceptional marksmanship, sound judgment, and uncompromising integrity had earned her respect from criminals and lawmen alike. The territorial governor had offered her a position with the state police, but she'd chosen to remain in Clearwater, protecting the community that had given her the chance to become who she was meant to be. The quiet minister's wife was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had found her true calling in service to justice. Thomas's ministry had flourished as well, as people throughout the region came to see the preacher whose wife was the famous Deputy Whitmore. On Sundays, Margaret still walked to church with her husband, but now she wore her badge alongside her. Sunday dress, a symbol of how completely she had integrated all aspects of her identity. The woman who had once hidden her abilities behind a facade of domesticity had become someone who used every gift she possessed in service to others. Clearwater had gained more than a deputy that Sunday morning when Garrett Hawthorne made his careless comment about barn hitting. The town had discovered that extraordinary people could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, and that sometimes the quiet ones were the most dangerous of all. Margaret Whitmore had found her true self, and in doing so, she had shown an entire community what was possible when courage met opportunity and skill was allowed to flourish without shame or apology. The rancher's mockery had unleashed something far more powerful than he could have imagined, and Clearwater was forever changed because of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.